By the time the fires died, the village of Ember Hollow was little more than a graveyard of smoke and blackened stone. The raid had come before dawn. No one knew whether it was bandits, mercenaries, or something worse. All Elias knew was that he had awakened to screams, grabbed the nearest hammer from his forge, and run into a storm of flame and splintered wood. By sunrise, half the homes were gone. The grain stores had burned. The old shrine at the edge of the mountain had collapsed into a heap of shattered marble and ash. Now the survivors moved like shadows through the wreckage, gathering what little remained. Elias stood in front of his ruined forge, soot streaked across his face, his hands trembling from exhaustion. He had spent all morning pulling beams off trapped villagers and using bare hands to carry water where buckets had failed. He should have rested. Instead, something pulled his eyes toward the ancient shrine above the village. The shrine had always been there, older than memory. The elders claimed it had once been built to honor the dragons that ruled the mountains before humans came. Most villagers spat at the stories. Dragons, to them, were monsters from old nightmares. But Elias remembered his mother's words. Not every creature born with fire is evil. Some just burn because the world fears their light. He climbed the broken path to the shrine alone. The place was in ruins. White pillars lay cracked across the ground. Carved dragon faces had been smashed beyond recognition. Beneath the fallen altar, something faintly gold flickered through the dust. Elias froze. At first he thought it was trapped fire, some ember still alive beneath the stone. But as he knelt and pushed away chunks of marble, the glow deepened, warm and steady, like a heartbeat. There were eggs. 5 of them. Each was the size of a large melon, their shells shimmering with veins of light, red, blue, green, silver, and deep gold. They were nestled in a hidden chamber beneath the altar, untouched by the destruction around them. Elias stared in disbelief. Dragons were legends. Dangerous legends. Behind him, boots crunched over stone. Old Marta, one of the village elders, had followed him up the path. Her face turned pale the moment she saw the eggs. "Destroy them," she whispered. Elias looked back. "What? Now?" she said, voice shaking. "Before they hatch. Before they bring ruin on all of us." He turned again to the eggs. They looked impossibly fragile for something that inspired such fear. Then one of them moved. A tiny crack spread across the golden shell. Marta stumbled backward. "Elias!" Another crack followed. Then another. Soft tapping came from inside, desperate and small. Elias's breath caught. The shell broke open at the top, and a tiny creature pushed its snout into the cold mountain air. It was no monster. It was barely larger than a house cat, with damp golden scales, blinking amber eyes, and clumsy little horns no bigger than fingertips. It looked around in confusion, then saw Elias. The hatchling made a weak chirping sound and dragged itself toward his hand. Something inside Elias broke and healed in the same instant. It placed its tiny head against his palm. The other eggs began to crack. Marta backed away, whispering prayers, but Elias didn't move. He could feel the warmth of the little creature against his skin, fragile and trusting. He looked at the ruined village below, at the smoke still rising into the grey sky, and then back at the newborn dragon in his hand. "No," he said quietly. Marta stared. "You fool!" "No," Elias repeated, stronger this time. He gathered the golden hatchling carefully against his chest as the others began to emerge into the ashes of the broken shrine. "Whatever destroyed this village," he said, "it wasn't them." Below, Ember Hollow mourned its dead. Above it, in the ruins of forgotten legends, a human chose mercy, and 5 dragon babies opened their eyes. By the 3rd day, Elias understood 2 things. First, dragon babies were always hungry. Second, they were chaos with claws. The 5 hatchlings had taken over what remained of his forge like they had been born to rule it. The golden one slept curled inside Elias's apron whenever he worked. The red hatchling bit everything: tongs, boots, chair legs, once even Elias's thumb. The blue one preferred hiding in water buckets and splashing anyone who came near. The green hatchling climbed everything it could reach, including Elias himself. The silver one watched the others with unsettling calm, as if quietly studying the world before deciding what to burn. Elias had named them by the end of the 1st week. The golden one was Soul. The red was Brim. The blue became Mist. The green he named Thorn. And the silver one, whose pale eyes seemed far too wise for a creature so small, he called Ash. "Family of disasters," Elias muttered one morning, surveying the damage. A sack of grain had been clawed open. His blanket was shredded. A water barrel had been knocked over. And Brim, proudly standing atop the anvil, sneezed out a spark that lit a pile of straw on fire. "Oh no!" Elias lunged for the bucket. Mist beat him to it, diving headfirst into the spill and flinging water everywhere with frantic little wings. The flame died, but so did Elias's last dry shirt. He stood there dripping while 5 dragon hatchlings chirped at him innocently. "You're lucky you're adorable," he said. They rushed him at once, climbing his legs, wings fluttering, tiny claws snagging fabric. Soul nuzzled his hand. Thorn perched on his shoulder. Brim tried to chew his belt. Elias sighed, but a smile slipped through anyway. Outside the forge, the village whispers had grown sharper. People had noticed missing goats, scorched grass, and strange cries in the night. More than once, Elias caught neighbors staring at his chimney when colored sparks drifted out after sunset. He did his best to keep the hatchlings hidden, but dragons did not understand secrecy. They wanted to follow him everywhere, into the yard, to the well, even into the market the one time he had been foolish enough to leave the door unlatched. That disaster ended with Mist in a fish cart, Thorn hanging from a signpost, Brim hissing at a butcher, and Soul asleep in Elias's hood while half the square screamed. Only Ash stayed near Elias's boots, silent and alert, watching the villagers with bright silver eyes. By nightfall, the entire village knew. "They'll bring hunters," Marta warned when she came to his door. "Or worse, men from the capital." Elias folded his arms. "They're children. They're dragons." Inside the forge, Soul made a soft chirp, as if answering the accusation. Marta's face tightened. "You think love changes what they are?" Elias glanced back as the hatchlings tumbled over one another near the hearth. Brim pinned Thorn. Mist pounced on Brim's tail. Ash calmly stole a strip of dried meat from the pile and walked away with it. Soul, too gentle to fight, dragged Elias's old glove into a corner and curled around it. "No," Elias said at last. "But maybe fear changes what we become." That night the dragons slept in a warm heap around his chair. Elias stayed awake, feeding the forge and staring at the door. Near midnight, Ash's head rose first, then Thorn's, then all 5. Boots crunched outside. Metal clinked. Voices murmured in the dark. Elias stood slowly and reached for the hammer beside the anvil. The hatchlings gathered at his feet, wings tucked close, eyes glowing in the firelight. Someone outside pounded once on the door. Then a voice called through the wood. "By order of the crown," it said, "open up. We know what you're hiding." And 5 tiny dragons bared their teeth. The pounding on the forge door came again, harder this time. "By order of the crown," the voice repeated. "Surrender the dragon young, and no harm will come to you." Elias tightened his grip on the hammer, though he knew how useless it would be against armed men. The hatchlings pressed close around his boots, their small bodies trembling, not with fear alone, but with something fiercer. Sol let out a low, warning chirp. Brim's scales glowed faintly red along his neck. Mist's wings twitched. Thorn crouched low. Ash watched the door with cold, sharp stillness. Elias exhaled slowly. He was not ready to lose them, but he was not foolish enough to believe the forge could protect them forever. "Back," he whispered. The hatchlings looked up at him. "Trust me." He moved quickly, shoving aside the iron rack that covered the old coal chute at the rear of the forge. Years ago, the passage had been carved through the rock to dump ash down the slope. A man could barely crawl through it. Dragon babies, however, could fit. The men at the front door began to force it open. "Now!" Elias hissed. Ash understood first, slipping into the dark tunnel. Thorn scrambled after him, then missed. Brim resisted, turning toward the door with a snarl too large for his tiny body, but Elias caught him and pushed him gently toward the opening. Sol was last, pausing only long enough to press his head against Elias's wrist. The front latch snapped. Elias kicked the rack back into place just as the door burst inward, and 3 royal soldiers stepped inside with spears and leather catch nets. Their captain, a hard-faced man in polished mail, swept his gaze across the forge. "Where are they?" Elias leaned on the hammer like a tired smith dragged from sleep. "Where are what?" The captain's eyes narrowed at the scorched beams, torn blankets, and claw marks across the floor. "Do not play the fool." "I'm not playing." The soldiers spread out, searching. One lifted a blanket with his spear. Another peered beneath the workbench. The captain approached Elias until they stood nearly chest to chest. "Dragon young are property of the crown," he said. "You are harboring dangerous beasts." Elias met his stare. "Then your crown is stealing orphans." The captain's hand moved to his sword. At that exact moment, a crash sounded outside, then a shout from farther down the slope. "Sir! Tracks! They're heading for the mountain." The captain cursed and turned sharply. "Move!" The soldiers stormed out as quickly as they had entered. Chasing Prince Elias had made days earlier hauling scrap up the trail. He waited until their footsteps vanished before dropping the hammer and rushing to the coal chute. He found the hatchlings waiting in the cold dark tunnel, eyes shining like buried stars. By dawn, Elias had made his choice. They climbed high into the mountains, far above Ember Hollow, where the air turned thin and sharp and the cliffs opened over endless forests below. The hatchlings rode on his shoulders, in his pack, and around his neck, restless and confused. Sol kept looking back toward the village. Brim kept trying to climb higher on his own. Mist snapped at the wind as though offended by it. Thorn loved every dangerous ledge. Ash observed everything in silence. At last Elias reached the edge of an enormous cliff. The valley spread beneath them like the whole world. He knelt and set Sol down first. "You can't stay hidden with me forever," he said quietly. "If you're going to survive, you need the sky." The hatchlings stared at him, then at the drop. Brim chirped in outrage. "Yes," Elias said, almost laughing despite the ache in his chest. "I know. It looks high." For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Thorn, reckless as ever, bounded forward with an excited squeal and leapt. Elias's heart stopped. Thorn dropped like a stone, once, twice, then his wings flared wide. The wind caught him. He wobbled violently, dipped low, then surged upward with a triumphant cry that echoed across the mountains. Mist launched next, gliding smoother than Elias expected. Brim leapt with all the grace of a thrown hammer, but somehow steadied himself through sheer stubbornness. Ash stepped off the edge like he had always known he belonged there. Soul hesitated the longest. Elias crouched beside him. "You don't have to be brave first," he whispered. "You just have to try." Soul pressed his forehead against Elias's hand. Then he jumped. Golden wings caught the morning sun as he rose. Elias stood alone on the cliff, watching 5 young dragons carve their first circles through the open sky. His chest ached with pride and grief all at once. He thought this was the moment they would leave him. But when the sun began to fall and the mountains turned red with evening, 5 shadows appeared again over the ridge. One by one, they landed around him in a rush of wind, chirping wildly, climbing over his arms and shoulders as if they had only been gone minutes. Elias laughed, tears stinging his eyes. They had touched the sky, and they had come back. Word of the dragons spread faster than wildfire. At first it was only whispers from traders passing through Ember Hollow, stories of 5 shadows crossing the mountain sun, of great wing beats heard above the storm clouds, of hunters who entered the northern peaks and came back pale, shaken, and unwilling to speak. But whispers became rumors, and rumors became reports. Before long, the truth reached the capital. 5 dragons, and all of them loyal to one human. To King Aldrin, that was not a wonder. It was a threat. He did not see Elias as a blacksmith in a ruined valley. He saw a man who had somehow done what kings, generals, and dragon-slayers of old never could. He had earned the devotion of creatures powerful enough to burn armies to ash. And if such loyalty existed outside the throne's control, then the throne itself was weaker than it appeared. So the king sent soldiers. Not a handful this time, not sneaking in the dark with nets and spears. He sent armored knights, iron wagons fitted with ballistae, and handlers carrying chains thick as ship anchors. They arrived at Ember Hollow beneath royal banners, marching into the valley like conquerors. The villagers watched in silence from their doorways. Elias stepped from his forge with soot still on his hands from the morning's work. He saw the captain at once, riding at the head of the column beneath a crimson cloak. "Elias of Ember Hollow," the captain called, "by decree of His Majesty, you are ordered to surrender the dragons into royal custody." Elias glanced upward. High above, 5 shapes circled through the clouds. "They are not yours," Elias said. The captain's jaw tightened. "They are beasts. Their family." At that, several soldiers shifted uneasily. They had heard the stories. The dragons were no longer hatchlings. Months had turned them into magnificent creatures, large enough to blot light from the forge yard when they landed, fierce enough to crack stone with their claws, and clever enough to understand more than most men were comfortable admitting. The captain drew his sword. "Seize him." Everything happened at once. 2 soldiers rushed forward. Elias barely had time to raise his hammer before a chain looped around his arms. Another struck his legs from under him. He hit the dirt hard, pain flaring through his shoulder. Around him villagers shouted. Someone screamed. Ballista crews rolled their engines into position, aiming upward. "No!" Elias roared. "Don't shoot!" But fear had already taken command. A bolt launched into the sky. It missed Soul by inches. The mountains answered. A shadow dropped from the clouds like a falling star, and Brim hit the first ballista with such force that would exploded across the yard. Mist came next, diving low, her wings throwing soldiers off their feet in a blast of wind and frost-cold mist that blinded men where they stood. Thorn landed atop a supply wagon and tore through the chains before they could be used. Ash swept over the rear ranks, precise and terrifying, driving knights back without wasting a single movement. And then Soul descended. He landed between Elias and the captain with a crash that split the earth beneath them. Golden scales flashed like sunlight through smoke. His wings spread wide, shielding the blacksmith behind him. He was no longer the tiny hatchling that once fit against Elias's palm. He was enormous now, beautiful and terrible, fire glowing behind his teeth. The captain stared up in horror. Elias, still half-bound, pushed himself to his knees. "Stop this!" he shouted, but neither side could hear reason over the chaos. Another soldier raised a spear toward Elias. He never threw it. Ash struck first, not killing, but disarming with ruthless accuracy, sending the weapon spinning into the dirt. Thorn roared from the wagon roof. Brim set another siege engine ablaze. Mist drove horses free of their harnesses, scattering the formation. All around the valley, the royal assault shattered under dragon fury. And yet not one dragon turned that fury toward the villagers. Not one touched the forge. Not one stopped guarding Elias. At last, the captain staggered back, sword lowered, face drained of color as he looked at the burning wreck of the king's pride. He had come to chain monsters. Instead, he had discovered guardians. Soul lowered his massive head beside Elias, and the blacksmith placed a soot-stained hand against warm gold scales. Around them, the valley smoked. Above them, 4 dragons circled like storm clouds. And in that terrible silence, the kingdom learned its mistake. The most dangerous creature in the mountains was not a dragon. It was a dragon defending the human who raised it. The army left Ember Hollow before sunset. What remained of it, anyway? Broken wagons littered the valley floor. Ballista frames smouldered in blackened heaps. Royal banners, once bright with pride, hung torn and scorched from fence posts and shattered wheels. Yet for all the destruction, the dead were fewer than anyone expected. The dragons had fought with terrifying force, but not with cruelty. They had broken the king's will, not slaughtered his men. That, more than anything, changed the village. The people of Ember Hollow had hidden in their homes when the battle began. They had expected fire, ruin, and blood. They had expected dragons to become the monsters old stories promised. Instead, they saw Soul stand over Elias like a shield. They saw Mist drive soldiers back from homes without touching a single roof. They saw Thorn tear apart iron chains, not human flesh. They saw Ash strike weapons from men's hands with impossible precision. They saw Brim, wild-hearted Brim, roar down at fleeing knights and then turn away rather than pursue them. And when it was over, the dragons did not claim the valley. They returned to the forge. Elias sat on the anvil outside, his injured shoulder wrapped in linen by Marta herself. The old woman tied the knot with rough hands and an expression he could not quite read. "You were right," she said at last. Elias glanced up. "That's not something I expected to hear today. Don't grow arrogant." But there was no bitterness in her voice now, only weariness and wonder. She looked toward the yard, where the 5 dragons rested among split logs, bent tools, and ruined carts like oversized cats after a long hunt. They could have burned us all. But they didn't. Marta nodded once. No, they didn't. Soul lay closest to the forge door, golden wings half-curled around the entrance, as if even now he meant to guard it. Mist had discovered Elias's old water trough, and was somehow trying to fit herself into it despite being far too large. Thorn perched on the roof beam, he had once been too small to reach, tail swaying proudly. Ash watched the road in silence, silver eyes tracking every movement. Brim, pretending not to be tired, had collapsed against a pile of coal with smoke lazily puffing from his nostrils. Elias smiled despite the ache in every bone. "You know," he murmured, "when you were small, you were actually harder to manage." Brim cracked one eye open and let out a grumbling chirp that sounded suspiciously offended. The days that followed remade Ember Hollow. At first the villagers kept their distance, moving cautiously, speaking in hushed tones when the dragons passed overhead. Children were the first to lose their fear. A little girl named Senna offered Mr. Fish from the stream, and was rewarded with a delighted trill that sent half the adults scrambling backward. An old shepherd found Thorn sleeping beside his flock one morning after wolves had passed in the night. Ash began appearing on the ridge whenever traders approached, silent as judgment, ensuring no armed fool entered with royal ideas. Sol helped Elias haul timber for rebuilding by lifting entire beams that would have taken 6 men to move. And Brim, impossible, destructive, loyal Brim, discovered that he liked the bakery because the ovens were warm and the baker slipped him sweet rolls when Elias wasn't looking. By the first snowfall, Ember Hollow was no longer simply a village. It was a refuge. Travelers came from distant valleys not to hunt dragons, but to see them. Some arrived in fear. Most left in awe. A few stayed, helping rebuild homes and workshops, drawn by the impossible peace that had taken root there. Humans and dragons learned each other slowly, awkwardly, honestly. It was not perfect. Chickens still vanished. Roofs occasionally suffered from badly judged landings. Brim once sneezed and took out half a fence. But life held. And through it all, no matter how high they flew or how far they roamed, the dragons always returned at dusk. Always to the forge. Always to Elias. One winter evening, as snow drifted over Ember Hollow and the mountains glowed silver beneath the moon, Elias stood outside his workshop with Sol's warm head resting against his shoulder. The others circled above, their wings cutting dark shapes across the stars before descending one by one into the valley of firelight and home. They had mastered the skies. They could have claimed peaks no human had touched, kingdoms no king could rule, horizons without end. But when night came, they still came back to the man who had first held them in the ashes and chosen mercy over fear. And in the end, that was the truth every song remembered. Dragons may belong to the sky, but love tells them where home is.